Welcome to the Woman's Connection. I'm Barrie-Louise Switzen, your moderator. The Woman's Connection is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned?
Welcome. When we hear about a millionaire or a millionairess or even a billionaire, we think, oh, they must have grown up with that money. How could they have managed to make the money? But you'd be surprised at the humble background of so many millionaires and multimillionaires, let alone billionaires. And to address this and how you can become a millionaire, I would like to welcome Dr. Jude Miller Burke. Doctor,
hello,
welcome.
Barry. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Same here. Before we get into the idiosyncrasies of becoming a millionaire and what it takes, tell us a little bit about your background, because you went from, I'm not sure if you want to say humble background.
Yes, I would definitely say that. Yes.
To a multimillionaire.
Right. I was from a rural area in Minnesota and grew up in a family where my parents owned their own business, but got into corporate America, worked for 10 years at Honeywell in Minneapolis, and then another 10 years as Vice President of Operations at Optum United Health Group. And then I moved to Paradise Valley, and everywhere I turned there were people that were very successful. But over a cup of coffee and a glass of wine, they would tell me about the problems they had as a child. So many of the people I studied were from humble beginnings, as you said. 25% were from lower middle class or low income families. And 20% just said outright that they lived in poverty growing up.
Wow, that's quite statistics there.
Yes, and another 50% were from middle class families. So these are people who really are self-made, who made it on their own.
Well, you wrote a book, and I love this, The Millionaire Mystique.
Thank you.
How working women became wealthy and how you can too.
Yes.
And I have to tell you, I wish this book was around when I started my career, because it gives you so much insight into do's and don'ts in getting ahead in the corporate world.
Yes.
What inspired you to write this book?
Well, it's very similar to what you're saying. When I grew up, I had very little guidance and bumbled away along and made my mistakes and probably had way too much emotion attached to what was going on in my career. And now at this age, I look back on my career and I thought, I have a lot of advice to give people that I've learned the hard way and I've gathered from a lot of other people. And I wanted to give it back to the community. I mean, times are hard. Economically, it's really challenging for people. And if I could make it easier for any people, that was really my goal. I wanted to do this. So, as you said, each chapter has self-assessments and tips, what to do and what not to do to become successful.
Now, when I was in the business world starting out, and a woman succeeded, it was, oh, she's sleeping with the boss. Has this changed?
I think it's changed quite a bit, but I was recently in a group of very high-level women in a variety of corporations in the Phoenix metropolitan area, and I was doing a presentation, and I asked them if they experienced sexism today, and I really didn't know what they'd say about that, and almost everyone in the room raised their hand, of these very powerful and successful women. So I think that maybe people aren't as blatant in what they say about how women become successful, but there still is this undercurrent of sexism. And even the men that I interviewed, and they were very gracious and very helpful in the advice they gave to women, and just in terms of how they enlightened us about what men were saying about women, they also agreed that there are more obstacles for women to become successful, and that it's much harder for a woman to be a leader than it is for a man. And I appreciated their honesty on that.
Well, that's fantastic that they said that, but what are they doing to help eradicate it?
Well, the men that I interviewed, one, everyone was very eager to fill out my research survey. I had over a 65% return rate, which for a scientific research study is pretty much unheard of. So people, the men and the women, really wanted to be helpful and to give back and let people, younger people, know what they did that led to their success. And the men were interviewed and they gave their advice, talking about how women could get on corporate boards, how important it is to be authentic and find your true self as a leader, and how that gives you much more power in the organization. So the men had a lot of good advice, as well as the women did.
Now, how does your background really shape who you are in the business world?
Generically speaking, or are you asking about me in particular, or generically?
Both.
Generically. Well, take the family you grow up in, for instance. My family was very industrious, so even though we were from a lower middle class family, my parents started their own business when they were 19 years old. So they did not have the opportunity to go to college, but they had 5 children, just boom, boom, boom. But they were very industrious. They started this business and became successful the old-fashioned way. They bought pieces of land, one parcel at a time, and then just a few years ago sold all of their land, and they have built up their business. So I learned from them how to work hard and to be conscientious. And in some ways they were like great white sharks. They never gave up. No matter what the detours were, no matter what the economy was like, they kept on going. And so I think that when you have parents who role model industriousness, you learn conscientiousness, and that can be very helpful. The other thing that I noticed that these self-made millionaires did, the men and the women, is they really picked what they wanted to take from their family of origin into their careers. So maybe they liked the extroversion of their father, but they liked the caring of their mother. They picked those qualities and left the negative things behind. So they take those qualities into the workplace.
In other words, many of these, let's stick with women, they don't do the poor me route. They are achievers.
Right. And on average, the women had 2 adverse childhood events. And as Malcolm Gladwell talks about in his book, David and Goliath, he calls them desirable difficulties. And I think in the world of social science research, we can now say that sometimes childhood adversity, as difficult as it can be, whether it's a chemically dependent parent, or growing up in poverty, or maybe the illness of yourself or another family member, makes you stronger. You learn how to cope at an early age, and then you take those coping strategies into your career as an adult.
Well, you see so many people saying, oh, they had all the benefits, but yet it sounds like they're doing the poor me as an excuse not to have succeeded. What do you find are the 5 personality traits of somebody who has succeeded?
The women I interviewed and studied were very, as I mentioned, conscientious. They were also higher than the national norm on extroversion. So when they would go into work, on a Monday morning, they would say good morning to their employees. How was your weekend? How is Joey's cold? They had boundaries at work, and they would socialize with people, but at the same time, they had very warm personal skills. They were able to socially influence situations. So they could read a person, and they would know what kind of language they're speaking, how to speak to them, figure out what their needs are, and to make situations a win-win situation. So they were conscientious, extroverted, and very open. And by openness, I mean they were very creative and inquisitive, wanting to know what are the latest trends in their industry. For myself, I can't help but read psychology books. I love them. I read them in my spare time. So I definitely picked out the right field for myself. The women I studied were also very agreeable, not in the sense that they said yes, and I'll come back to that, but in the sense that they were very affiliative. They bonded with people at work. They had a team. They had a support network inside the workplace and outside the workplace. And in terms of neuroticism, they left it at the door. So overall, this group of women was much less neurotic than the average population. And it also, I want to mention too, that over 50% of the women said they were comfortable arguing a point to closure, which is somewhat unusual. And over 60% of the women said their family and friends had told them they were argumentative.
It sounds almost like a double standard. If a man argues, nobody thinks anything of it. If a woman argues her point and stands up for her rights, she's argumentative.
Well, I think we're socialized, to be agreeable as women and to think of the needs of other people, and to put our needs aside. I mean, a lot of being a great mom, and I love motherhood, but a lot of what you do when you have little children is you put your needs aside for a great length of time. But these women were very comfortable arguing a point to closure and didn't have that guilt that a lot of people have in terms of taking the arguments personally. They were able to have the good debate, have a good fight at work, and then leave it at the door.
They say never let a man see you cry, sweat, or get angry. How do you curtail when you want to bash somebody's head in so that they come out thinking you're fantastic?
Well, I definitely wasted too much emotion on things in my career. I remember the first time I had to fire someone, and I probably cried about it for 4 days. And in retrospect, now I realize that once you're in a management position, hiring, supervising, training, and sometimes letting people go is just part of what you have to do. I recommend, when I do executive coaching, is for people to practice mindfulness techniques and to raise your self-awareness of, at any point in time, how you're feeling, and to watch yourself and see when you're getting aroused by a certain situation, and then to be able to step back, do some deep breaths, and then decide what you want to say, not just say whatever comes to mind. And so it's really important to manage your emotions for women at work, for other women, and for men, because that's how you get self-respect. I mean, if you're going through a merger or an acquisition, if the employees see, or your peers see, someone running around and being very emotional and anxious, that's not going to be for the greater good of the organization. What you want is someone that can temper their feelings, stay optimistic, manage their emotions, and that will help calm the whole work group down.
You also talk about quiet the chatterbox.
Yes.
And I'm trying to do meditation. I've been on and off of this for a long time. I'm still having troubles getting through 15 minutes. What do you see on the positive side on meditation, and do you see it increasing the number of people doing this?
I highly recommend that people choose whatever it is that helps them become centered. And whatever you can do before you go in to start your workday, whether it's meditation, some people it's prayer, some people it's being in nature, exercise. One of the multimillionaire women that I interviewed gets up at 5 a.m. and she runs on the treadmill every day. That's what centers her and makes her more optimistic at work and feel more like she can relate better to people. But I think meditation is wonderful. I too, on and off, practice meditation.
What are some of the detours that these women have found along the way, and how did they get back on track?
70% of the women stated that they had detours, and 50% of the women talked about outright failures. But all the population I studied had failures, and they really described failure as just a part of the success. It just kind of comes with the territory. But the detours that the women experienced oftentimes had to do with childbearing, child rearing, sick family members, caring for sick family members, having an illness themselves, sometimes moving across the country for their partner's job. But one of the points that I give in my book that I think is so important, that I had never heard when I was younger, is that it's so important to negotiate with your partner or your spouse up front. You know, who is going to take care of that second shift? Because the second shift can be grueling, especially if you have multiple children. Who's going to get up with kids who are ill at night? Who can take time off of work the next day to take the child to the doctor? Who can do the driving to the soccer practice? Who can attend the soccer tournaments that sometimes might be out of town? So to negotiate with your partner up front is so important.
Have you found that the biggest mistakes women make at the office to be?
I think oftentimes because women relieve their stress by becoming close to someone, but you don't want to be telling coworkers about your marital difficulties, for instance, or that your child was, you know, in jail over the weekend. I mean, you don't want to be sharing those kind of things. So you can be supportive and warm and authentic, but at the same time have some boundaries. So that would be something for women to think about. Also, we worry. I mean, we have so much responsibility. I know that the first couple of years I had a 1-year-old, 1.5-year-old, and then I had twins. And I was still trying to do the vice president of operations job at Optum. It was very challenging. So as women, we worry a lot, and it's almost like we think the worrying will kind of stave off bad things from happening. But it's really important, as you mentioned, to do a meditation practice and do some calming, silence the inner chatterbox, you know, and to really try to leave some of that neurotic tendencies at home.
How do the millionaire women, once they've reached this plateau, do things differently?
They've had to come to terms with what their values are, and it's not easy. I grew up in a family where my mom was a very hands-on mom, and she worked in their business, but she was home when we got home from school, and we had the warm chocolate chip cookies and the fabulously cooked meals, and she attended all of our events. But to do a corporate job or to own your own business, early on the women have to come to terms with what their values are. What do they want to have hands-on with? Do they love cooking? So they're going to be meticulous about cooking all the meals for the family, or maybe it's playtime with the kids, maybe it's bike riding or hiking the mountains. So they look at their values and they decide what it is that's important to them. And then they come to terms with that guilt. I mean, no one really likes to, I don't think, have much help in their home, and you want to be the sole provider for your kids, but it's critical that you allow your partner or your spouse to help with the kids, and then hire some babysitters, and maybe hire someone to take the dry cleaning to the laundry. And then as the children's needs change, you know, what you need for a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old is very different than what you need for a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. Make sure that you change the care that you have and the help you have to reflect the needs of the family. And to protect that family time. Maybe it's breakfast every morning together, maybe it's dinner, maybe it's those family trips, but to really protect the family time.
What do you see as the difference between women and men in communications?
Women often do what Deborah Tannen calls, Dr. Deborah Tannen, and she's written many different books. Women do rapport talk, which is more, how are you feeling? You know, are you going through any changes in your life? You and I were kind of having a little bit of that dialogue before the interview started. And men do more report talk. Did you watch the football game? What do you think the weather will be? So it's rapport talk versus report talk. But what I've found is that women can learn from men, which took me a long time to figure out. Sometimes you don't need to talk about your feelings. Sometimes you don't need to talk about what's going on at home. And vice versa, men can learn from women. Women need to be comfortable and have relationships with men, because to get all those opportunities you need for your career to really flourish, you need social capital, is what we call. But you need social capital not only from the other women, you need social capital from the men.
These women have a roadmap of how they were going to get to the end game, or do they just go where the wind kind of blew?
I would say on average the women were more analytical and more thoughtful about how they were going to progress in their career trajectory. But at the same time, you can't, if you haven't been a mom before and you're trying to balance work and family or integrate work and family, it's really hard to conceive what that will be like. You don't know if you'll have a child with special needs, or you just don't know what that will be like. But what these women had in common is that they just didn't stop. And I'm probably a good example of that. No matter what came my way, I just picked it back up and kept on going. And I found that with a lot of the women that I interviewed.
So it's just keep on trucking and you'll get there.
Right. But I do think that one thing we have learned is that it is really important up front to negotiate the family responsibilities. Because even though these women were millionaires and multimillionaires, 50% of the time they were going home and still absorbing the second shift. And that's exhausting. So I highly recommend, and I have, as I mentioned, tips and advice in every chapter, that they negotiate about who's going to do what and have a very organized schedule at the beginning of each week, to the point where they know what meal they'll be having on a Wednesday evening, and whether it's takeout or someone else is cooking or you're cooking, but to really have the details worked out and involve the whole family in the schedule. And so as the children get older, they know what their responsibilities are also.
Think in 5 years things will really change? The men will take a more of a hands-on attitude?
I see my stepsons and what they're doing with their families, and they definitely demonstrate that. They're very much hands-on fathers, and I see that with a lot of the younger generation. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, children need both mom and dad, and economically, 2 incomes are very necessary quite often for families to, maintain.
To say laughter is the best medicine. Well, laughter cures a lot of illnesses.
Yes.
How can that be to your advantage in a workplace?
Well, sometimes when there's, say you're arguing over, say you have a bunch of vice presidents in the room and you're arguing over the pot of money that your group gets for their commissions for the year. I mean, it can get very tense. And say it's around the holiday time too, so we'll throw a little more in there. I mean, the arguing and the debate can get very personal and challenging. You can imagine how the person that's able to step back and make a joke and lighten things up is just really appreciated by everyone. And I know at United Healthcare, we had a sales vice president, Phil, and we could always rely on him for a little comic relief. And it was very helpful to the whole well-being of the work group.
Suggestions or tips would you suggest in finding a mentor to help you up the ladder?
The first consideration is working for a good company with good family-friendly policies, right? And so more of a nurturant, a warm, when I worked at Honeywell in the 80s, it was very much a mentoring kind of organization. So just so happened, my first mentor was a woman, Susan, and she taught me how to read financials. She taught me how the world worked in corporate America. And then my next boss was a man, and he did the same thing. So I think upfront picking the right company is really helpful. Some companies have formal mentoring programs. So sometimes you can find your mentor and your supervisor. Sometimes you can join the formal mentoring program, or industry associations you might find a mentor, and then community organizations can have mentoring programs also. It can even be a family member, potentially, and you can have different mentors for different areas of your job. You may have someone that's helpful with the financials if you have a big budget, but you also may have someone that's helpful with doing sales presentations. So you can have a myriad of people that are helping you. It doesn't have to be just one person. And I also think it's important that you give something back to the mentor also. So maybe you read a great article and you're able to give that article to your mentor, so that it's that rule of reciprocity, that you want to give people something in return for what they're giving you.
Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage, and everybody in it is an actor or an actress. Do millionaire women act like a millionaire woman until they make it?
Fake it until you make it?
Yes.
I think that is somewhat true, that there is an internal drive, and there may be a sense of inferiority from where their roots came from, but there's also at the same time a sense of superiority and self-discipline, you know, that they really believe in themselves and they keep on moving forward in spite of whatever is thrown their way.
Write about being a social influencer. How can that help you along the way?
Say you're going into a group of people and you have purchased a company. Maybe you're on the East Coast, you've purchased a company in the Midwest, right? It's very important as you bring those two different groups together that you're able to articulate what the vision is. I mean, you want to be a great leader and you want to articulate what is the vision and be able to acknowledge what each group's needs are, and then talk about how you're going to bring the needs of each group together and how you're going to progress into the future. So that is social influence, knowing what people's needs are and having persuasive communication to get them to see things the way you see things and to really listen. It's important to be authentic. If people believe you're authentic, so in a way, yes, actors are on the world stage. At the same time, you can fake it until you make it, but I would definitely throw in authenticity. And the women need to be who they really are. I'm not oftentimes a very assertive person. I am very caring, which is what my mom taught me, and I think is one of my better qualities. You know, and so for me to go in the workplace and to be very harsh and autocratic just wouldn't happen. So you need to go with who you really are. Take those personality characteristics and find out what kind of leader you're most comfortable being, and then be that leader. And that's what will help you persuade people, because you'll have relationships with people. The relationships will be solid. So then when you go into a difficult situation, you'll have that trust, you'll have your network, and it will be much easier to make things happen.
One of the worst sentences somebody can say to me is, well, we've never done it like that before, or we can't do it. How do these women overcome this? Because my comment is always saying, well, there's always a first time for everything.
So you must be high on the trait of openness. Inquisitive, creative, curious, like to change things up. But yes, there can be obstacles thrown in your way in your career. But I too have experienced a lot of those obstacles, and my guess is you just keep moving forward. You could say you have a project that you want to do and your boss isn't very open to it. You could say, I won't take any time away from my other responsibilities. Let me just give this a try for a month. Let's try a pilot project and let's see how it goes. What you want to do to become successful is to take on challenging tasks and grab those opportunities as you can. Sometimes they will be formally built into your job, and sometimes it's informally. And then you can move forward on your creative ideas.
Today is a typical day for these women who've made it.
The women I studied, and we studied women in Canada, East Coast, West Coast, Arizona. They all seem to be very organized, because they have to be, at work and at home. And they have a lot of self-confidence. Now, this is probably a whole nother show. Interestingly enough, the women's self-esteem was not higher than the normative population of women. So even though these women have become very successful, they don't necessarily feel better about themselves. But on the other hand, part of self-esteem is an internal locus of control. And these women are very clear on what their needs and wants are. They're not like a puppet being pulled in all kinds of different directions. They know what their needs and wants are, and they keep pursuing them.
That's interesting that you say that their self-esteem is not that high up on the charts. I'm just blown away by that.
I know, isn't that surprising? But I think it speaks to, just like my chapter on sexism, you know, and detours, it speaks to that we still have issues that need to be addressed. You know, the integrating of work and family, dealing with sexism in the workplace. I mean, I used to be called Little Flower all of the time, and I just, you know, there are different ways. And in my book, the women describe different ways to deal with sexism. So we still have a lot of issues that still need to be addressed.
I remember when I first came to New York, I was working with this one man, and he'd always call me honey and love and honey. And it just got to the point that I was going to gag on this. And I said, my name is Barrie. And he said, oh, I thought you liked it. I said, no, I don't. It's very demeaning. And my supervisor, who was a woman at the time, she said, oh, you should just let it go. And I thought that was degrading.
I think her response was degrading, and I agree with you. It sounds like you handled it wonderfully. I mean, you do need to speak up at different points. There is no doubt about it. I remember walking into a meeting and a consultant twirled me around and actually had the audacity to put his hand in my hair. Well, the secretaries in the work group had already complained. I didn't have to say anything. He was out the door and his contract was terminated. But yes, it's very important to speak up and not let it just go underground. And you can solicit the support from your male peers too. They see it happening. I had some wonderful guys I worked with, and they would say, if you're feeling this, this is accurate. This is what's going on behind the scenes. And so men and women can be very helpful, and it isn't necessarily based on gender.
What would you say the percentage of these women own their own business?
50% of the women own their own businesses, and either in the past or currently. And so they had a lot of variations in their careers. Some had worked in the nonprofit world, some had practiced medicine, some had owned their own businesses. But at the same time, if the business wasn't meeting their expectations and their business plan, they were willing to let go. What you don't want to do is start a business and 2 years down the road, when you haven't been making any profit, still be trying to make that business float. You really want to have a realistic business plan in place that you probably use an accountant for. The women also manage their money very well. They have investment advisors, and they live beneath their means. They're not living on credit. These are people that they could be buying another handbag or another pair of shoes, but they're not doing it. They're living beneath their means, and that and saving money, and that helps lead to their millionaire status.
Do they enjoy their wealth?
What I found, and I talk about this in the last chapter of the book, is so many of these women are giving back. In fact, the profits from this book are going to the Fresh Start Women's Center in Arizona. And so many of the women I know, they want to give back. They want to help the younger generations prosper. And so I think they do enjoy their lives, and they've been through a lot. And the average age of the woman I studied was 55. And so she had been through a lot, and she was enjoying her success.
Share with us 2 stories of women who succeeded beyond all comprehension.
Well, one of the women owns a family law practice, Hollier and Lawrence in Phoenix, Arizona, and she grew up in a middle-class family, and unbeknownst to her, after she got married, she started experiencing domestic violence. And so she had one child, she got divorced, she had custody of the child, she put herself through law school, then she started a family practice, and now she has one of the best-known family law practices in Arizona. And she just wrote a book called The Wise Divorce. And so I would say she's a success, and one of the funniest and happiest people you will ever meet. There's so many women that I respect. Pat Pesnick's story is also in my book, and her sister Bev Stewart, and they founded the Fresh Start Women's Resource Center. And it opened its doors 10 years ago, and we serve 5,000 different women every year, writing resumes, teaching interviewing skills, wardrobing, on-the-job training, and helping them find jobs.
Jude, in the closing moments of the show, what would you like to leave the audience with?
I want women to know that if I can do it, they can do it. And by reading this book, you will get practical tips and advice and self-assessment, so you know what areas you specifically need to work on, and that you can do it. I believe in you, and you deserve it.
Well, Jude, thank you so much for joining me. It's very interesting to learn about other women succeeding. And are you succeeding? This book really gives you a lot of background information on how to succeed. Practically at any age, you can become a millionaire. I always think of Colonel Sanders becoming wealthy in his old age. Love to hear from you. Please write us here at the Women's Connection. Bye now.